Is there anyone sick among you? Let them send for the priest of the church. Let the priest pray over them, anointing them with oil in the name of the Lord. What we heard in today's second reading from the Epistle of James. Suffering. What does our culture and society say about suffering? First of all, they say it's meaningless. No good can come from suffering. It's to be avoided at all costs, to be avoided like the plague. No pun intended there. And that we need to just push it aside, do everything we can to avoid it. It's meaningless. What did the ancient cultures think about suffering? Well, for them, there was a very fine line between spiritual well-being and physical well-being. Somehow or another, the two were connected. Remember the story of the man born blind in John's Gospel? We'll hear it during year A in Lent this year, when the disciples asked Jesus, did this man sin or did his parents sin that he was born blind? So it was thought to be a connection. People who were suffering were in disfavor somehow with God. It was either meaningless or was kind of like a punishment for transgressions. And one day, on a hilltop that kind of looked like a skull, everything changed, didn't it? Jesus Christ suffered and died for you and me. Suddenly, suffering has a great deal of meaning. That suffering and his resurrection and his ascension to his Father changed everything. The world was made new by that. Suddenly, suffering did have meaning. He gave meaning to it. And it wasn't that you were in disfavor and being punished by God that you would suffer. But maybe you were chosen by God in some way, that suffering now was meaningful. We see throughout the Gospels that in Jesus' ministry, healing was very important, wasn't it? He preached, he taught, he healed. Our Gospel today from the second chapter of Mark shows that. Throughout Mark's Gospel, Jesus goes around healing people, doing what we call miracles, what Mark calls mighty deeds. And he restores people to health. He saves people. Isn't it interesting that the word in English salvation comes from a Latin word solace that means health? See, Jesus took compassion on those who were suffering, those who were in pain, physical, mental, spiritual, emotional. And he tried through his power to help them. And we know that in the 6th chapter of Mark, he sends his apostles out 2 by 2 to do what he did, to preach, to teach, and to heal. And we hear how they anointed people with oil, and many people were restored to health. That healing ministry of Jesus then continued in the early church. And our second reading from James tells us how the early church did it, by letting the priests, the presbyters, go out and anoint people with oil. And it became a sacrament, didn't it? One of the 7 sacraments of the church. As the Baltimore Catechism, and those who know me know I'm from Baltimore, so I'm partial to the Baltimore Catechism, the 7 outward signs instituted by Christ to bring a particular grace into people's lives. Or as the New Catechism puts it, in number 1131, an efficacious sign that Jesus entrusted to his church. And so we get the sacrament that today we call anointing of the sick. And so, biblically speaking, there was both physical and spiritual potential for healing when this sacrament was performed by the priest. But as time went on, the emphasis turned from physical healing and something that you could receive to something you received on the point of death, on your deathbed. And those of you who are old as I am remember, it used to be called extreme unction. And it was only given on the deathbed. And all of us had a special crucifix in the hallway between the bedrooms. And you would take it down and turn it, and inside were cloths and candles and everything else for when the priest came at the very end of life to give this marvelous sacrament. Vatican II came along and had us relook at the sacraments. And they said, we need to go back to the original meaning of the sacrament, which took into account body, soul, and spirit, and not something that just happens on the deathbed. Now, many people still think that. I've been a priest now for 13 years, and there have been times when I've gone to see somebody at a hospital that doesn't know me personally, and I'll say, I'm here, if you want to, I can anoint you. And they say, oh, no, Father, I'm not dying. Like as if I anointed them, this was the end. Okay? No, you don't understand. It's anointing of the sick, something to be done throughout life when we become infirm, if we get aged, if we're going to have a medical treatment, an invasive treatment done, if we're hospitalized, and we're asking for God's grace to come into our lives to help cure us or to give us comfort. Today, we're going to celebrate this communally. But you know, every sacrament is a public act of the church. Even those times when I go to the ICU at Baptist East or wherever, and there's nobody else in the room, and the person has all of this equipment on, and they're unconscious and everything else, it's a public act, because that's what the liturgy is. It's the public work of the church. And it's always public, no matter how private it may seem. But it's even better when we come together communally to celebrate this sacrament within the context of the Eucharist, the source and summit of our very Christian lives. And when it is last rites, by the way, and if the person is able to, the last sacrament they should receive is the Eucharist. It's called viaticum, isn't it? It's the bread for the way. So how fitting it is for us to come together this 10th year now in a row on this World Day of the Sick to communally celebrate this sacrament of the sick with you. So as we come to celebrate this, we need to understand a major theology in the church, that theology of redemptive suffering, that when we suffer, we join our sufferings to those of Christ for the salvation, the health of the world. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's not a punishment. But we can turn that suffering, which seems totally evil and bad, into something that's good. Because we gain merits, don't we? Merits for ourselves and merits for others, so that they don't have to suffer so much either.